Good morning, everyone. I'm Martha Blackwell, Vice President of the Canadian Council for the American, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the sixth episode of our series, Colombia Continues Searching for the Center, the 2026 Elections. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you our distinguished guests, two prominent business leaders who are joining us to share their perspectives. David Bojanini, former CEO of Grupo Sura, and Antonio Celia, former CEO of Promigas. And our hosts, Sandra Borda, professor and researcher at Universidad de los Andes, and Ken Frankel, president of the Canadian Council for the Americas. So now, let's give the floor to Sandra to begin the conversation. Sandra? Hello, Martha. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Afternoons or evenings, if you're watching the video. It really is a pleasure again to meet with you again this space, which is devoted, as you are well aware, to discuss what is the probabilities, the dynamics of the political center of Colombia. This is a series that we've held. This is the second season. We began it in the past elections. This is the sixth episode. And what we do is really discuss the ideas, what nurtures the political center, what it consists of. And we've begun dynamics that I think is very interesting. And it's to talk about the topic, not only with politicians, but today, for instance, we have representatives from the private sector, which of course should be part of this discussion on the political center and our next elections. So it is a pleasure to be with Antonio Celia and David Bojanini. Let me begin then with the question and the discussion that we always begin this series, which is related to the use of the term political center. In these six episodes so far, we've had different emotional and rational ways of looking at the political center and the word itself. So let's begin with David. How comfortable do you feel with the use of the term political center? How do you conceive it? What emotional and rational reaction do you have using this term? And then we'll give the floor to Antonio for the same question. Sandra, thank you. And thank you to the Canadian Council for the Americas for this invitation. I would say that the center is defined by what happens on the extremes. The world has been polarized. The world has been creating extremes. And those extremes have enhanced much more in past years. So we have what we call the extreme right or the extreme left. And their performance can be very similar in the extremes of how they approach the problems. And that's why, perhaps, those that are not wanting to be in both extremes think about the center. So, what's for me, or how would I define the center? It's the capability not to go towards dogmas or for what a group says, but instead trying to see the whole picture, political picture, try to see a specific problem in which you should see it from all angles and objectively to be able and well informed to be able to think and decide what's the best solution for a problem, but not simply because I'm on the extreme and the dogma of that extreme should be approached this way. And I have to say okay to that. I do believe that the center has a virtue, and it can analyze and be empathetic. It can listen. It can really hear and listen the viewpoints of others and to try to decide for what the center thinks could be better for the country. I feel comfortable thinking that way because I don't like in any way to be forced towards dogmas or the paradigms set by a determined group. It's good to analyze in a changing world all viewpoints. So to begin, that would be my vision of what the center is. It's like somebody said, grace of high trust. This keeps happening. Grace, yes, but with high levels of pragmatism, right? Is that what you propose? Sure. Meaning, for instance, what's happened in Colombia? If somebody from the center gives an idea which the right said at any given time before, the opposite side tends to disqualify that person and say, or the opposite can happen as well. Those of the extreme right say something that somebody from the center is more of the left because they think differently to the right. So there's no way of thinking or discerning on many things. Yes. Okay, Antonio. I feel good in the center, but it's really a relatively new center. Well, first of all, Ken, Sandra, David, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. And also the Canadian Council for the Americas for inviting me. The term is relatively new because although I'm not a politician, I always thought I was a liberal. So that liberalism is with the center. As an anecdote to find the center, I experienced when I had a discussion in a panel that I had, we had many social leaders getting killed. And with those assassinations, the left say that it's a crime of the state. And the right says it's something else. So somebody has to say that it's not both extremes. So what's the center? It really is, let's sit down, look at things closely, and analyze what's happening. So you can define the center in many different ways. And I think it's important, the ones in the center, to qualify it because of the political results it's had in democracies in the world. We've got the really the center is the democracy built by Europe, and also what Camargo Restrepo made in Colombia, which has had good results, and less emotions, more reasoning, respecting others, inclusion. And it's that balance that we should have. And then these conversations between the left and right, because heated up, because one, the extreme left or the extreme right. I don't think that either is good. The radical things are not good in this case. It, so there's got to be a balance with it or intermediate oppositions. Also, in terms of taxes, which are so important for business people, the center promotes capitalism that's controlled, regulated smartly, in which the private sector can have balanced taxes so they can contribute with the social investment needed, but also drive investment. These are all the optics of the center. I even remember that the center will be always giving good results. Now, what am I told? The center doesn't excite people, but I disagree. Maybe I'm getting into something difficult, but I think then when you look at the surveys friends, you see that most of the people say that Colombia is of the center. Maybe they have their own definitions, which is okay, but then a candidate called being of the center asks, what's happening that people don't vote for me? Because I'm supposed to reflect their ideas of moderation, being rational, of what's really happening. Maybe I haven't explained myself well. I haven't resorted to the emotions that the people need to vote for me, but it is convenient to review what's happening because although there's a lot of people that say that they're in the center, they are not getting the results needed. This obviously has to do with the polarization. And it would also be good to look at what was the point of inflection of the polarization. Why are we so radicalized in Colombia? So, to conclude, yes, I feel comfortable with the center. We have to redefine it. I think we have to educate people. I think that the results of the political parties have been transforming and have been essential in many societies. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. In the past, there were a couple of topics which were red lines for the center, which were determined to a to a certain point in the center, like 3 years ago or more. It it was to support the Peace Corps, and that's not on the table now as a red line for the center. But do you believe that there are certain topics that we have to have a consistent viewpoint on to be considered to be in the center or of the center, Antonio? I really didn't understand your question, Ken. I mean, there's a red line, or there are red lines to be or not be of the center. There are topics that you have to believe in to be of the center. I would say that in the past, to support the peace agreement was a topic. We began 3 years ago with Humberto de la Calle, and he always talked about supporting the Peace Corps. And that should be a condition to be considered in the center. So my question is, do you think that now we have topics used to define the center? Let me add this, Antonio, to to give it an additional angle. Not only the topics, but the condition. For instance, Robledo said here that in the center you can the center as the coalition that's being built with Fajardo and others. You cannot conceive that the center has people that has been part of governments that have hurt the country so much. So those that have been with Uribe or Petro cannot be in the center because there have been results and damages and they don't share ideas. So that's a red line that they divide or that they set out. So the question is not only which are the positions on certain topics that you deem are fundamental to say that you're from the center, but also in terms of political militants, what conditions should somebody be or follow to be in the center? In really there are elements that are imperative to the center, respecting the ideas of others, human rights, everything that decisions based on evidence. That's part of the center. With I understand what Robledo says, but I think it's part of a particular judgment made because of their past. But again, it's part of political agreements and mechanics. I don't know if you could be so taxative on that. I reserve that opinion because it really has to do with something more personal. But what I do see that the large problems of the country are are differently seen by the right and the left. And I think that there is the problem. I mean, No one discusses that security is fundamental for society's well being. But how do you manage to have security? And there you have all the ranges, and that's where nobody agrees. Instead, the center procures for security has to do with controlling the territory, a strong state, but with dialogue, social investments, and a list of tools that make you integrate people to society, which today are violent. Although I believe, and this goes off the topic, I think we should start changing our language. We cannot keep on talking about wars or conflicts, but instead of violence. The definitions matter because they have to do with diagnostics and solutions. Now, the center has a fundamental prerogative in the development model. The development model of the center relates with liberal democracy, power balance, respecting private prosperity, capitalism. But here's a big difference with the right and the left. And since we're business people, this is important. I want capitalism, I want it decent, regulated and smartly, which is hard to do. So, when it comes to the country's problems, I believe that we will agree on the problems. But the difference is how we will, if they will be solved by the left, by the right, and the center. One last example education. We are really behind in education. Our education is really bad, the quality is bad. 50% of kids 10 years old in Colombia cannot understand the text they read. It makes no sense. So we all want quality education, right? The left says, surely, everything has to do paid by the government. It's got to be state. The right, no. Private amplitude. But the center can use different alternatives that work and that provide results and that are met and meet the purposes set forth. Those are my ideas about the center. David, I agree with what Antonio said, and I would say that the red lines for the center, there are some. It could be dogmatism. You cannot have a single way of seeing things. Respecting the institutions, that's fundamental. Democracy, as Antonio mentioned, is fundamental for those of the center. But what happens? The extremes always try to go against the institutions, impose their ideas, and try to look at things from a single viewpoint. For instance, security that Antonio just mentioned. We have heard candidates say that the solution is is guns and bullets. And I think it's a poor viewpoint for security. We are experiencing a serious security situation, and to improve the security of Colombia, there are measures that should be taken beyond doing things with force. Surely we have to enhance the authorities, but we have to enhance our justice system, military intelligence, and intelligence in general, technology. I mean, it's a shame that today those that use technology with drones are the armed groups to attack civil populations and the armed forces. So there are a series of things, but undoubtedly, as Antonio said, to improve security, you have to have institutional presence. And it's not only the public force, but we need people with social investments also in those territories. Because I've always thought one thing. Here we talk a lot about equality. equality is something more of a utopia, but it can be reached, eh, especially with what happens in the public. So when we talk about investments in the territory, public utilities, water, power, sanitation, sewage, but also healthcare, education, justice. So if the governments would invest more on these things that are public, in which there should be equitable conditions and territories, surely security would improve and it would help the country to be better off in that, but also in many others, which make people not to have hope and the armed groups to take the gap there is, the vacuum there is of the state and territories. And when you start seeing forces, illegal forces, that control most of the territory. So I would say that for the center, going back to your question, there are red lines, and it's that the solutions should be those that look at the problems from every angle. I mean, a problem of security is not guys that are doing something illegal and want to control a territory. But these are territories where the state has not been present and require many other things. However, that's a good example because a lot of people provide simple solutions and say, let's do things by force to recover security. And that's a problem or a strategy that's never ending and will never find a solution. So there, for me, that's an excellent example of what the center should not do. And we've fallen on that a lot. And Antonio talked about emotions before, and there's people that think that the country is getting out of hands, there's no authority, and that we need a government that has a strong hand, a strong fist. So we have autocratic leaders that are seen now many more in the world. And people think that with this type of leader we can solve the problems of the country, but no. When we start talking about autocratic leaders, we start to be violent against the institutions, democracy, human rights, many things that are very important today in people's lives. Uh, if you can, will you allow me to speak? Sure, sure. Go ahead. There's something that we shouldn't forget, and I think that our political leaders forget the quintessential of of what politicians do with citizens is divided into five: employment, health, security, and good life for seniors. If you look at this through corruption, these are the problems that the people have for the past 50 years in Colombia. So when the state forgets that this is what it should do for the people, this is where you have the autocracies and people with personalities that are dangerous, very dangerous, that can lead to dangerous results. The center also has to talk about the results it produces, right? The results obtained throughout the history in every democracy of center. I think that speaks for itself. And also, we have to sit down and discuss what has to happen for the center to win. When you say that somebody has to appear that excites, many pathologists say, because they say that that messiah, that person that's charismatic, could be like a caudillo. I think that Macron in France is a good example. He has won twice with ideas of the center that he made everybody feel enthusiastic. And we know that France is more left. And I love to study Felipe Gonzalez as well. Felipe was a charismatic man. He made extraordinary changes based on a socialist party. And he, and something else of the center, he joined and heard, transacted, understood the people. Because I do believe that today the politics is very personalist. And I think Sartori said this several years ago. He wrote a book, it's called Obedience, and he said, look, politics have changed. Now it's image, it's acting, it's convincing, and it's being charismatic. So to be elected, you have to wake up emotions, but you have to appeal to emotions. And keeping that in mind, and going back to the question on the performance of the center, to the Colombian text context, Antonio, let me ask you something more political and less conceptual. I think there are really two questions, one tied to the other. First, the center has not reached the executive power, but it consolidated as a political force in Congress during this during this last period. And considering the exercise made by the center, which hasn't been unified, but what the center has done, either as an independent or opposition force, and keeping in mind also the performance of what's the balance or your take of what the center has done for Colombia so far. And why am I asking this? It goes to the second question that Antonio almost answered. Only by building a balance can we have a disaggregation of the mistakes and good things done to have a better learning curve for this next campaign. So I think it's very important to do this balance. What's your take, David? I would like to continue to answer your questions to what Antonio was saying before, as follows. Sometimes people think that being at the center or the ideas of the center do not excite politically. And since politics are headed more towards having to say things that excite and attract and capture the attention of the people, the most simple thing to do is to give populist ideas, very simple ideas, without any content, true content that says this is what the country needs. If you look at the discourse of Rodolfo Fernandez in the past elections, he only said that he was going to end corruption, and he said it mad, and that created emotions among many, but no content whatsoever, really. So I believe that the center can establish solutions and postures that are clear with regards to the problems of the country based on an analysis and say and explain them very well. And that can excite a group of people that want to see true, real solutions, not specific things like populist ideas or the ideas of using force or things like that. So, with that, we can excite people with a rational discourse that will be explained, will be attractive to people speaking very simply with a simple language. So, if I go to the previous elections, it was a disaster, the center. The candidates of the center started to fight among themselves. Their ego was way too big. They didn't set clear postures with regards to the country, but instead they attacked each other and they polarized. And that was very sad. and nothing was left from the center. I don't know if somebody was helping to sabotage the center, but nothing happened. But now what we need is to have people that it's balanced and rational, that analyze the problems and help to set good solutions. Sometimes we think that the center can't be those that were in one political party or in the left. No, that's why we always talk about the center, left, or center, right. And there's people in both extremes that have ideas that are more liberal and more conservative, and they're good ideas and they're moderate, they're good to solve problems as well. And there, I would say, is where most of the people are. That's why we always think that the center can steal votes from the right or the left. And that's true because there's a lot of people that prefer to have positions. For instance, you say, I'm from the 100% center or pure center. That's becomes dogmatic. You have to be able to analyze the ideas of all sides and to know how to think or decide what could be better for the country. It could be an idea from the right or a moderate or an idea that's more liberal, but that will really help us find better solutions and postures. What did I observe among the candidates? That they didn't have very clear postures regarding the problems of the country. Because sometimes being of the center, you wrongly think that you can't have a position with regards to a topic. But no, those that are of the center have the chance of analyzing all of the viewpoints and choose rationally what's best. And there is where I think that things can change. It was to the point that the center let the left take over topics that are very important today, like climate change or discussions about gender. And all this was left for the left and other things. So obviously, when you can't give an opinion for sure and objectively on something, others do. And the others know how to appropriate those with extreme ideas. And that's what hurts the politics taken regarding these topics. So I believe that the center has fallen short. It hasn't been able to have postures, clear ones. And lastly, politically, I'm sure that in every party, there's a lot of people that's balanced and that think that, as Antonio said before, the definition of public servant is very important. Sometimes it's lost. Politicians sometimes forget that they're public servants and they start working with hidden agendas and other interests, including having the keeping the power, but power for what? So there, I think that there's something that has been lost. But there are many politicians that do believe that they're public servants and they analyze things from many angles and they're not led by dogmatic positions that cut off their ideas and smarts and brains. Antonio, I want to thank Sandra, Zoe, and Ken that the center should rescue the notion of efficiency, which is lost. I believe, I don't remember ever that the country talked so much about politics and and poor politics have taken over. That the bad practices we're seeing, that's hurting the solutions that we need. I should have begun by saying that almost always that I talk about this, I say that this country is better than 30 or 40 years ago. Let's not forget that. To think that this is a disaster that will lead to radical solutions and abrupt is not what's going to happen. But for me, the challenge is that we have to advance better in all of the indicators that people care about. The center should rescue efficiency because its solutions should be effective. Should they should in the center solve the problems of the people. And this could go through pragmatism, but it's so. So if you could look at different topics, how they are addressed by the left or the right, and how they should be addressed by the center. When we look at education, which is so far behind, both extremes say all private, even private vouchers, which is neoliberal, which was terrible, and the other side, all the state. But it turns out that El Pilo Paga is a program that gave extraordinary results because it gave money to poor students that were A students. But Pilo Paga said, we're not going to privatize education, but this is not true because I'm paying for all that. So when the center can adopt positions that give results, it can present itself as the party that solves the problems because it's not fighting radically, holding on to ideas that are not valid because the world has changed. This has to do a bit also with what Hitchman talked about. Sometimes the radicals, the dogmatics, think that with a fist, left or right, many of the problems are solved. But no, really, we need to solve problems gradually. And let me give you an example. I believe that today no one discusses that health should be universal and free for all, right? But that wasn't true 20 years ago. Now, what's the problem today? How is that service provided? Only the left says only the state, nothing from the private sector. And if that would work, I would say okay, but it doesn't work. The empirical evidence that the left is running away from many times doesn't show that. So here's the center should look for different combinations for healthcare because the idea is to have precise measurements and you can tell your electors, your voters, by combining elements and tools, I can provide a better service of health. So the center should be a platform or a party that solves the best way possible people's problems. And this also has to do with the dichotomy, simplifying this a lot, that characterize left and right. Some say equality, it's desirable, and liberty, but none exist. But we have to adopt a joint ideas that gives us liberty and equality. Okay, may I add something? Sure, David. Now that mentioned, Antonio mentioned a word that's being used as an insult today, and it's neoliberalism. I believe, and that and everybody associates this term. So because people think that the health service can be helped by all versus the state, which is extreme, that doesn't work, with the state is less efficient, more expensive, and submitted to or more permeable to corruption. So there we have the roles of the state. Healthcare in Colombia, for instance, was well qualified. The healthcare services and social security in Colombia were qualified among the best of the world. It did have problems. For instance, a problem. that it was that there were EPS that made mistakes that fell to do things that were incorrect, but that wasn't the biggest problem it had. They had. And for instance, to hear people say that you cannot make profits with health, that sounds for some, well, of course, somebody's earning money with healthcare, but if the service is well done, efficiently done, and it meets the system, why can't you earn money if you invested money to provide that public service? Why can't anybody profit from it? And if we look at the other side, health entirely handled by the state, it's much more expensive, which were some profits, normal profits from the private alone, is now stolen by corruption and efficiency multiplied by whatever you want. So at the end, and also the service is poor. So I would say that to disqualify that the privates can participate providing public services, I believe that you have to be careful saying that state the exaggerated power of the state is a political strategy to have more control of public resources and to be able to use that for political ends. And I think that this is something that we have to look at very closely because when you handle the entire health care service in the state, you start to handle the people, and that's not good. So I think we have to be very careful to avoid disqualifying things that have worked well. And we should, and that's what I was saying before. Polarization and extremes begin by disqualifying very easily things and saying that neoliberalism is bad. Neoliberalism has to end. But no, it's not that bad. And I'm not ashamed to say that I support the ideas that are neoliberal, provided there comes a center. These are used moderately. Health is provided by the privates, yes, but what is the health superintendents for? Isn't it to control those that provide the service? We didn't have a health superintendents that worked well, and maybe that's why irregular things happened. But if we would, why did the financial system work so well? Because we have a good superintendents. So that is the role of the state to control and monitor, but not to provide the service inefficiently and expensively. Let me intervene again. I don't know if I can, but because now that I haven't seen David for a long time, so let me talk with them a bit. Let me add, perhaps I'm more socialist than David, and we discussed this many times. Remember, he's from Antioquia, and I'm from the Caribbean. We are rebellious, and everything is okay in the coast. But let me show you, talk about this example. Although it's true that the center believes in capitalism and markets, it's not a dogma. And I think, and there's a great book about that of a gentleman called Frankel, who says capitalism remained alone. But no, capitalism has triumphed. The results of capitalism are favorable. And today, all capitalists with the combination with strange combinations like those of China and Vietnam and autocratic and liberal regimes. And this is a result given. But I think that when it comes to healthcare, there are moral dilemmas that the private sector faces. So you can have in the private sector sensitive issues that work. What's key is regulation. How can you regulate? Who you regulate? And I think that that's what failed in our health system. So it's an art and it's hard. So the center thinks that it can regulate well. The left says, I can't regulate. The privates are always going to try to maximize their profits, which is true. And since there's certain symmetry, I can't do it. The center instead thinks it can be regulated. And there's an example that you might not remember a lot, but I did because I lived it firsthand. And there were center politics with great results. And it was the massification of the use of natural gas in Colombia, which I lived as the CEO of Promigas, has been one of the most successful of the world in the past 30 years because we made rigorous studies. We used a natural resources of the state with a regulation impeccably good, with good control through the superintendents and an entrance or a welcome of the private sector, very well regulated. And the results were so good that they deserved several years ago that the paper Promigas would have social impacts and chosen as the best of the world. And for me, that's a lab or an example of how things can be done. And it's a perspective of the center. It's not radical on one side or the other. And the combination of elements that the center can provide creates results that benefit the people because natural gas, which is used, has profits and reduces poverty. That's something that I wanted to add. Thank you, Antonio. I have several questions, but David, would you like to add something? No, I'm willing to hear everything. Yeah, well, I'll talk with him next, afterwards. No, but we do have other questions for. No, we do agree that the state has to be a regulator. And Antonio mentioned the superintendents, and I also mentioned the superintendents of health. But these superintendents never really played the role that should have, and the regulation perfectly could have regulated the abuse made by the providers, the health providers of the services. But let's not get into that. No, let me give a small note. Public education is very important. It's imperative to have quality education. But when you look at the rankings of the public universities of Colombia and the coast, it's a shame. So we say that it's important to have education, but a poor kid going to a university that ranks 10th or 107th, obviously the student will want to go to the 10th. Thank you for, let's shift topics. I understand that we can't generalize on topics like this, but do you believe that there is a consensus or marked divisions between the executive publics in security, education? I mean, there is a consensus or more divisions? And if there are marked divisions, is it by sector or region? What do you believe, David? I believe that there could be, for among those of the center, there could be consensus where you could arrive to consensus on these problems, on these issues. Because if somebody acts like the center says, we should start seeing how to analyze the problems, to look at the different aspects that we have to work on. And there's where you can reach consensus. So, in that sense, I believe that the people of the center wouldn't have a difficulty if they act as a center to reach consensus because that's invented already. And when we talk about topics like health, education, safety, etc., when you start to analyze these issues, you start to see the rise of different solutions if you have the mental expansion to analyze these issues from different angles. And surely you would reach a lot of consensus. But what happens? We go back to the discussion that we already covered. When we make a political campaign, people tend to seek or to establish ideas that are simpler and perhaps excite the voters more. And that's where the consensus aren't seen. But I would say that whoever's from the center easily reaches consensus on these issues, undoubtedly. Okay, Antonio, following that, do you think that we have more center type of executives in Colombia? I believe overall, or I have the impression that overall, the Colombian entrepreneurs, and I say in the best terms, is of the more of the right. And what happened with the threats and the violence, that's what I feel. And the example that I give, and I measure this simply with how many entrepreneurs went were for and against the Havana peace process. So we gathered a lot of people and formal organizations there, and I believe that that was a point that went towards that polarization and radicalization that we have. When it comes to the political viewpoint of the issues, if we had a virtuous state that could provide health and education of top quality and free for all, you didn't need the private sector, but that doesn't exist. So you have to find the optimal combination for that. In terms of security, what's the difference? Or better, why is security something so difficult? It should be an imperative in which that the right took over for a long time, and now the left is only talking about. So when it comes to security, the difference is given by the carrot and the stick. And the same with health. There are public health systems in the world that work very well and don't have the dichotomy of regulating the private sector. But the reality is different. So So when you are aware that a private sector can work well, the left says no, because its idea is fundamental. So the center comes with more ideas about these to solve these issues. And I believe that the Colombian society agrees on what we need. The difference is how. And what we should seek are the minimum agreements on certain topics on which there should be no discussion. I don't know, improve early childhood, a nationwide purpose that joins us all, that makes us happy, that makes us think that we have an achievement, because this is very important. Last question, because we're running out of time, and I'm going to ask you to provide short answers. What, in political terms, has the political CERN learned after 4 years being under the left? I think that what has been learned the most is that politics is not only for politicians, but instead we all have to participate in politics. What does that mean to participate in politics? Not to simply say that I go vote, but also we need to listen much more. We have to be more aware of what's happening in the country, if possible. We should participate in discussion groups. I'm not in favor of being in a doctrine. I'm against that, but I'm a friend of discussions. I want people to be more mature politically because countries that are politically mature are citizens that understand the problems and can think about them and not to go and do things emotionally. Because what has happened is that when we have a government of extreme left, like we have today, we tend to see that our emotions seek our emotions, and that's not good because to be on the other side, there aren't good answers either. So that's why I talk about maturing politically. And it's very sad sometimes to hear entrepreneurs that have extreme positions and don't see beyond how problems can be solved and how things can be done with objectivity and more scientifically analyzing the situations and proposing good ideas. I think that's what business people should arrive to. I'm not saying that all, but many are more extreme today, thinking that the solutions are more extreme and almost autocratic can be the solution to a government like the left autocratic government that we have today. I think that the example is hurt by the characteristics of the leader that we have today. I think his leadership is very poor, no matter how you measure it. And this has enormous effects on society. There are many cases of positive and negative leaderships. So, beyond the idea of left or social impacts, leadership is poor here. If I was a business person, I would change the profile. I wouldn't be doing things reactively, discussing when I get tax reform, but instead I would say, I'm going to make a pact with society. We as business people will pay this in taxes, but let's talk about how we can invest this money, these taxes. And we have to be aware that there are changes that have to be made. Inequality in Colombia is serious, and it cannot be corrected only with social investments and taxes. So I think that being aware of this is very important, and we should be more proactive on that. Indeed, when Colombia has experienced crisis and the business people have to pay for the war or peace, they do so. So taxes are important between business people and the state. What a positive agreement can be made. So through a lasting contract, there we can have certain impacts, and that goes through virtuous cycles. You pay a tax, and you show that the tax is paid, and what's being done with a specific task. So the business people say, okay, we pay high taxes to do all types of things. And they question everything. But there is something that we're missing. And we're told, yes, we have to elevate the discussion to have more collective actions, more empowered civil societies, and be more proactive as investors and the social impact that that can have. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, David, Antonio, Ken, Sandra, for this great conversation. I think it's been one of the most dynamics that we've had in this series. Thank you all for joining us today. And we invite you to follow us on the social media to receive news about upcoming episodes of this series on the Center in Colombia, as well as other events that we hold. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you. Thank you. Until next time.